The car rolled through the quiet stretch of road, the headlights carving out a narrow path in the darkness. The faint hum of the engine mixed with static from the radio, barely loud enough to break the heavy silence inside. I stared out the window, watching the blurry outlines of trees flash by, their shadows stretching long and eerie under the moonlight. Beside me, my boyfriend drove with practiced ease, one hand resting on the wheel. He looked relaxed, but I could sense the fatigue in his posture, the way his shoulders slumped just slightly. Behind us, my adoptive brother sat sprawled in the back seat, his presence heavier than it needed to be. The evening had been uneventful. A family dinner filled with forced laughter, predictable jokes, and the usual pleasantries. But as the night dragged on, I couldn't help but notice the quiet looks my brother had sent my way. Not outright stares, but deliberate, intentional glances that lingered just long enough to make me uneasy. I shifted in my seat, suddenly aware of how small the car felt. The air seemed too still, the temperature too warm despite the cool night outside. My brother moved in the back seat, and the sound of fabric brushing against the seat felt louder than it should have. His presence behind me was unsettling, though I couldn't quite explain why. The ride stretched on, the silence growing heavier with every passing mile. The sudden jolt of the car slowing down snapped me out of my thoughts. We'd pulled over, the tires crunching against gravel. My brother had asked for a stop, something about needing fresh air. As he opened the door, the cold night rushed in, bringing with it a strange tension. I avoided looking at him, staring ahead at the empty road. But I felt his gaze on me, heavy, deliberate. It wasn't a feeling I could shake, and as we started moving again, the weight of it lingered, wrapping around me like a second skin. The rest of the drive was silent, but it wasn't peaceful. It was a silence that left too much room for thought, too many unanswered questions swirling in my mind. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I climbed out of the car, my legs stiff and unsteady. Inside the house, I went straight to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. Standing in front of the mirror, I stared at my reflection, trying to piece together what exactly had shifted tonight. But no matter how long I looked, the answers didn't come. Only the unease remained. As I climbed into bed later, the house dark and quiet around me, I closed my eyes and tried to will myself to sleep. But the memory of his lingering gaze and the unspoken tension in the car replayed over and over in my mind. I turned over, clutching the blanket tighter around me. Something had changed, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to understand what it was. The next evening was supposed to be ordinary. After the tension of the previous night, I hoped for normalcy, for the chance to breathe without feeling the weight of unspoken words pressing down on me. My boyfriend suggested a quiet evening at home, something simple. He pulled out a board game, eager to unwind, and I agreed, desperate for the distraction. We set up in the living room, the coffee table covered in pieces and cards. My brother joined us, though his presence was anything but casual. He settled into the chair across from me, leaning back as if he owned the space. His every movement seemed deliberate, calculated. As we played, I tried to focus on the game, to immerse myself in the harmless competition. But every time I reached for a card or moved a piece, I felt his eyes on me. Not in the way someone casually watches a game, but in a way that made my skin prickle, my hands clumsy. He made small comments throughout, the kind that could easily be dismissed as jokes. But there was an edge to his tone, a sharpness that wasn't lost on me. My boyfriend laughed them off, oblivious, his attention on the game and his next move. I envied his ignorance. At one point, I reached across the table for a card, and my hand brushed against my brother's. It wasn't much, a fleeting touch, but it lingered just long enough to make my pulse quicken. I glanced up and our eyes met. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity in his gaze was undeniable. The moment passed in a heartbeat, but the heat it left behind stayed with me. I pulled my hand back quickly, pretending to adjust the pieces in front of me. My boyfriend didn't notice, too caught up in his next move. After the game ended, my brother offered to help clean up. I wanted to say no, to find an excuse to escape his presence, but my boyfriend agreed before I could speak. In the kitchen, the tension was suffocating. We moved in silence at first, the sound of running water and clinking dishes filling the space. Then he spoke, his voice low and calm. "You think I don't notice?" His words cut through the air like a knife. I froze, my hands tightening around the dish I was drying. "Notice what?" I said, my voice steadier than I expected. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned closer, his presence overwhelming. You know what, he said finally, his tone almost mocking. I put the dish down, forcing myself to meet his gaze. This isn't funny, I said firmly, though my heart was pounding in my chest. He smirked, a slow knowing curve of his lips that made my stomach twist. No, he said. It's not. I turned away, grabbing the nearest towel and wiping my hands. We're done here, I said, my voice clipped. I walked out of the kitchen without looking back, my chest tight and my thoughts racing. Back in the living room, my boyfriend was scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the storm brewing just a room away. I sat beside him, forcing a smile when he looked up at me. But even as we watched TV together, his arm casually draped over my shoulder, I couldn't shake the weight of what had just happened. My brother's words echoed in my mind, leaving me with a feeling I couldn't name. Something was breaking and I didn't know how to stop it. The morning unfolded quietly, the kind of stillness that clings to empty houses. My boyfriend had left early, his hurried goodbye punctuated by the faint hum of his car disappearing down the road. I lingered in the solitude, savoring the rare day off and planning to tackle a list of chores that had grown too long. The house felt peaceful at first. Laundry piled high, dust motes swirling in the sunlight streaming through the windows. It was an ordinary day in every sense. The rhythmic routine of folding clothes and tidying up was almost soothing, a way to occupy my hands while letting my mind wander. The sound of the front door opening shattered the calm, jolting me upright. I froze, my mind racing. I wasn't expecting anyone. Seconds later he stepped inside. My brother's presence filled the room in a way that felt heavier than it should. His keys dangled loosely in his hand, and he casually slung his bag over his shoulder as if nothing was out of the ordinary. He claimed he'd forgotten something, his laptop or maybe a charger. I didn't ask for details. Instead, I turned back to the laundry, keeping my hands busy and my focus away from the shift in the atmosphere. The air seemed different with him there, thicker somehow. I felt his gaze lingering, and though I didn't look up, I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. It wasn't the first time, but today, alone in the house, it felt more intrusive. He didn't leave immediately. His footsteps were slow, deliberate as he moved through the room. My pulse quickened, though I wasn't sure why. It wasn't his words or his actions, it was the silence. The charged, lingering quiet that seemed to fill the space between us. I kept folding, focusing on the precise edges of the fabric, the sharp lines of a neatly stacked pile. My movements were mechanical, an attempt to ignore the unease growing in my chest. The house, once so peaceful, now felt stifling. Every sound, the rustle of clothes, the faint creak of the floorboards, seemed amplified. I shifted my weight, hoping he'd leave, but he didn't. The moment stretched out too long, tension building with each passing second. When he finally moved toward the door, the release was almost palpable. The quiet returned, but it wasn't the same. It carried an echo, a reminder of the interaction that had just occurred. As the door clicked shut behind him, I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. The laundry basket sat untouched now, the task forgotten in the wake of his presence. I sank into a chair, my hands trembling faintly, though I couldn't explain why. The room felt empty again, but not in the way it had that morning. It was a different kind of emptiness, one that wasn't comforting. I stared at the window, the light still streaming in, though it now felt harsher, more intrusive. I tried to shake it off, to brush away the unease like dust settling on a surface. But it clung to me, refusing to let go. Something had changed again, subtle but undeniable, and I couldn't pretend it wasn't there. The house was still again by the time I gathered myself, but the quiet no longer felt like a reprieve. It felt heavy, like the silence carried the weight of something unsaid. I threw myself back into chores, determined to scrub away the lingering tension. Dusting, organizing, wiping surfaces that didn't even need it. It became my way to silence the nagging thoughts circling my mind. By the time evening came, the house was alive again, though the energy felt fractured. My boyfriend had returned home, tired but cheerful, eager to unwind. He suggested a simple night, a movie, maybe a board game. I agreed, hoping the routine would ground me. When my brother walked in shortly after, the ease I had tried to rebuild shattered. He greeted us casually, but I could feel his presence shift the atmosphere. It was subtle, like the faint hum of a distant storm, but it was there. We set up in the living room, the board game taking center stage on the coffee table. My boyfriend sat cross-legged on the floor, his smile easy as he shuffled the cards and explained the rules. My brother took his place on the couch, lounging with the kind of relaxed confidence that made it clear he didn't care much for the game. I focused on the pieces, on the act of playing, but his gaze burned into me, stealing my focus. Every move I made seemed to invite some quiet commentary from him. The tone was light, almost playful, but the edge beneath his words was unmistakable. When I reached across the table for a card, our hands brushed. The contact was brief, barely worth noting, but it felt like an electric shock. I looked up, meeting his eyes for just a moment too long. There was something in his expression I couldn't name, but it made my chest tighten. I pulled back quickly, pretending to adjust the game pieces in front of me. My boyfriend, oblivious, kept talking about strategy, completely missing the undercurrent swirling between me and my brother. The game ended eventually, though I couldn't tell you who won. I was too distracted, too caught up in my own spiraling thoughts. My brother stood, stretching lazily, and offered to help clean up. My boyfriend agreed easily, but I hesitated, my stomach sinking. In the kitchen, the tension that had simmered all evening boiled over. We worked in silence at first, the sound of running water and clinking dishes filling the air. I focused on the task, on anything but him, but I could feel the weight of his presence beside me. He finally spoke, his voice low and calm, the words slicing through the air. His tone wasn't accusatory, but it was knowing, a quiet challenge I wasn't prepared for. My chest tightened as I kept scrubbing a dish, pretending I hadn't heard him. But I had, and I knew he could see through the act. He didn't press further, just stood there, his presence looming over me like a shadow. When I finished, I set the dish down carefully and walked out of the kitchen without looking back. My heart was pounding, my thoughts a tangled mess of emotions I didn't want to name. Back in the living room, my boyfriend was scrolling through his phone, completely unaware of the storm brewing just a room away. I sat beside him, letting him wrap an arm around my shoulders, but the comfort I usually found in his touch was absent. The tension wasn't something I could shake off anymore. It clung to me, seeping into every thought, every movement. I tried to focus on the show he had put on, to lose myself in the bright colors and loud laughter, but my mind wouldn't settle. That night, as I lay in bed, the darkness of the room felt suffocating. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts racing in circles, unable to find rest. The tension between my brother and me was no longer something I could ignore, and the weight of it pressed down on me. Relentless and unforgiving, the cracks were widening, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold everything together. The next day, I woke to the soft light of morning filtering through the curtains. For a brief moment, everything felt still and manageable, like the tension of the previous days had been nothing more than a bad dream. But reality settled in quickly, the weight in my chest returning the moment I moved. I decided I needed to reclaim some sense of control, to focus on the one relationship that mattered most. My boyfriend. He had been patient, attentive, and kind, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. He deserved my full attention, not the distracted version of me that had become all too common lately. By the time he came home from work, I had planned a small surprise, a quiet dinner for just the two of us. The table was set with candles flickering softly in the dim light, their warm glow casting comforting shadows on the walls. The smell of roasted vegetables and freshly baked bread filled the room, and I had put on a dress I knew he loved. When he walked in, the surprise on his face turned into a broad smile, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. He pulled me into a hug, murmuring something about how thoughtful I was, and I allowed myself to sink into his embrace, letting it anchor me. We ate slowly, savoring the meal and the rare quiet between us. The conversation was light. Stories from his day, plans for the weekend, but I couldn't stop myself from watching his face, studying the way his smile reached his eyes. I wanted so desperately to hold on to this moment, to lock it away somewhere safe, untouched by the chaos swirling around us. When the plates were cleared and the wine glasses were refilled, he leaned closer, his hand brushing mine across the table. There was a softness in his gaze that made my chest ache, and before I could think too hard about it, I leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't just a kiss. It was an attempt to convince myself that everything could be okay. That I could focus on him, on us, and let everything else fade into the background. For a moment it worked. The warmth of his lips, the way his hand gently cradled my cheek. It felt like a promise of stability, of normalcy. But as the kiss deepened, my mind betrayed me. Unbidden, the memory of my brother's lingering stares and cryptic words crept in, unraveling the fragile sense of peace I had tried so hard to create. I pulled back, forcing a smile as I sipped my wine, trying to shake the intrusive thoughts. He noticed, of course. He always did. "You okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "Just tired," I said, my voice steady but distant. He didn't push, but the moment was already slipping away. The warmth of the evening, the glow of the candles, it all felt muted now, overshadowed by the weight of what I couldn't bring myself to admit. Later, as we lay in bed, his arm draped over me in a protective gesture, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The guilt was unbearable. I hated myself for letting the tension with my brother seep into this, for letting it steal away the joy I had tried so hard to create. I turned over, pressing my face into my boyfriend's chest, willing myself to find comfort in his presence. He stirred slightly, his hand moving to rub slow, soothing circles on my back, but it didn't help. The truth was, I couldn't escape the chaos inside my own head. No matter how much I wanted to focus on the man beside me, my thoughts always drifted back to the unspoken tension, the moments I wished I could erase. As the night stretched on, I lay awake, my heart heavy with the weight of it all. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, torn between what I wanted to be true and what was really happening. The cracks were growing deeper, and the more I tried to ignore them, the more impossible it became to hold everything together. The next day was no better. If anything, the unease had settled deeper, taking root in a way I couldn't shake. My boyfriend had left early again, his day packed with meetings, and I busied myself with mundane tasks around the house. I cleaned, organized, and tried to lose myself in the rhythm of routine, but the tension was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. By mid-morning, the door opened and I froze. I didn't need to look to know who it was. My brother's footsteps echoed in the quiet house, slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. He called out a greeting, his tone casual, almost cheerful, but it didn't match the weight of his presence. I stayed in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter as I waited for him to appear. When he finally did, he leaned against the doorway, watching me with the same unreadable expression that had unsettled me for days. "You're always keeping busy," he remarked, his eyes scanning the room. His tone was light, but there was something behind it, a subtle challenge that made my skin crawl. I didn't respond, focusing instead on wiping down the counter. My movements were steady, methodical, but inside my nerves were frayed. I could feel his gaze, sharp and unwavering, like he was waiting for me to crack. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. He didn't move, didn't say anything else, just stood there watching me. It was a game to him, I realized. A test of how far he could push before I broke. Finally, he stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood closer than necessary, his presence overwhelming, and the air between us seemed to vibrate with unspoken tension. I wanted to step back, to put more distance between us, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. "You know," he said, his voice dropping just enough to make my stomach twist, "you don't have to keep pretending." I stiffened, my grip tightening on the cloth in my hand. His words were vague, but the meaning was clear, and it left no room for denial. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice cold and steady despite the chaos inside me. He smiled faintly, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was knowing, calculated, and it made my pulse race. He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sure you don't." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in around me. I needed him to leave, needed to be alone to gather my thoughts, but he wasn't going anywhere. I turned away, focusing on the task in front of me, but my hands trembled as I worked. He didn't say anything else, but his presence loomed, a silent reminder that he was in control of this moment, not me. When he finally left, the relief was almost overwhelming. The house felt bigger, emptier, but at least the tension had lifted. I sank into a chair, my hands shaking as I pressed them to my temples, trying to calm the storm inside my head. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went through the motions, completing tasks without really registering what I was doing. My thoughts were stuck in a loop, replaying every word, every glance, every unspoken threat. By the time my boyfriend came home, I was exhausted both physically and emotionally. I plastered on a smile, pretending everything was fine, but I could tell he noticed the strain in my expression. He didn't say anything, just wrapped an arm around me and kissed my forehead. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The tension was too much, the weight of it pressing down on me like a physical force. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer and fears I couldn't shake. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something, a precipice I couldn't see the bottom of. And no matter how much I wanted to step back, I couldn't seem to move. The next day unfolded quietly, but the calm felt forced, like the uneasy silence that lingers before a storm. My boyfriend had left early again, leaving me alone with the echo of his parting words and a house that seemed too big, too empty. I distracted myself with cleaning, folding laundry, and rearranging drawers, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind from wandering to places it shouldn't. By early afternoon, I was in the living room, sorting through a pile of books that had been gathering dust on the coffee table. The rhythmic sound of pages flipping was almost soothing, but then came the knock. I froze. It wasn't the front door. It was the back, the one we rarely used, the one that led directly to the small patio. My pulse quickened as I walked to it, the familiar unease settling into my chest. When I opened the door, there he was. My brother stood on the threshold, his posture casual, but his eyes locked onto mine with a sharpness that made my stomach turn. "You left the gate open," he said, his voice even, almost bored. I hadn't, and we both knew it. I didn't respond, stepping aside to let him in because saying no wasn't something I could muster. He walked past me, his movements deliberate, claiming the space like it belonged to him. I followed him into the kitchen, watching as he leaned against the counter, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "You always keep busy," he said, glancing at the books in my hands. His tone was light, almost teasing, but it felt like a critique, like he was dissecting my every move. I placed the books down carefully, ignoring the way my hands trembled. He didn't move, didn't say anything more, just let the silence stretch between us until it became unbearable. "What do you want?" I finally asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pushed off the counter, closing the distance between us in a way that felt calculated. His presence was overwhelming, filling the small kitchen with an intensity one couldn't escape. "I think you know," he said, his voice dropping just enough to make my pulse race. The air was thick now, heavy with unspoken words and something darker I couldn't name. My chest tightened as I stepped back, trying to put space between us, but he matched my movements, his gaze never leaving mine. "You can't keep pretending," he said, his tone soft but relentless. I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm not pretending," I said, though the words felt hollow, like they belonged to someone else. His smirk widened, and the look in his eyes made my stomach twist. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was something closer to satisfaction, like he was winning a game I didn't know we were playing. The moment stretched unbearably long, and I felt the walls closing in around me. The tension was suffocating, pressing down on me until I couldn't breathe. I needed to end this, to get him out of the house before the unspoken crossed into something irreversible. "You should leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment he didn't move. His gaze lingered, heavy and unreadable, before he finally stepped back. "Sure," he said, his tone almost amused. He walked to the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at me. There was something in his expression I couldn't name, something that made my skin prickle. Then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my legs trembling and my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The silence of the house was deafening now, amplifying every stray thought, every lingering emotion. I sank into the nearest chair, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, the pieces wouldn't fit. The lines between right and wrong, between what I felt and what I wanted, were blurring in ways that terrified me. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I moved through the motions, cooking dinner, cleaning up, and waiting for my boyfriend to come home. When he finally did, I threw myself into the normalcy of our routine, clinging to it like a lifeline. But that night, as I lay in bed beside him, the events of the day replayed in my mind over and over, until the tension became unbearable. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but it didn't come. The cracks were spreading and I couldn't ignore them anymore. Something had to give, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what would happen when it did. The morning felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself had thickened overnight. The light streaming through the windows seemed muted, casting the house in a dull gray. I moved through the quiet, performing tasks I barely registered, folding laundry I'd already folded, wiping down counters that were already clean. The repetition was a flimsy shield against the growing unease. I knew he would come. He always did. The knock on the door came sooner than I expected, but it didn't startle me. I opened it without hesitation, and there he was, calm, composed, pretending as though the last few days hadn't been filled with tension. Stepping inside, he moved through the house as if it were his own, trailing fingers along the edges of tables and shelves, pausing every so often to pick up an object before setting it down again. I stayed in the living room, feigning busyness, arranging and rearranging a stack of magazines. My hands shook as I worked. When he entered the room, he stopped behind me, his presence suffocating. I felt the weight of his gaze before I turned around. He was closer than I expected, close enough to feel his breath on the air between us. My chest tightened, my breath shallow. His eyes held mine, not blinking, not wavering, and the silence stretched unbearably. I took a step back, hitting the edge of the coffee table. He didn't follow. He just stood there, letting the tension hang like a heavy curtain. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. He finally broke the stillness with a single movement, leaning down to place the magazine back on the table. Then he straightened, his gaze flicking over me one last time before he turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the house in an almost deafening quiet. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, the room spinning around me. My knees trembled as I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. No matter how much I tried to steady myself, the unease wouldn't fade. The rest of the day passed in a blur. My boyfriend came home, his usual warm smile and tired eyes. He kissed my cheek and held me close, but I could barely return the affection. The weight in my chest only grew heavier. I sat next to him on the couch that night, his arm around my shoulders, the flickering glow of the TV washing over us. He watched the screen, laughing softly at a sitcom's punchline, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts churned endlessly, replaying the silent moments that felt louder than any argument could. I curled into his side, the warmth of his body offering a fleeting comfort. But deep down I knew it wasn't enough. I had crossed an invisible line, and there was no going back. The tension hadn't gone away. It had only deepened, spreading through the house like a slow, suffocating fog. Every corner felt heavier, every room smaller. I found myself moving more quietly, as if the simple sound of my footsteps might summon something I wasn't ready to face. The morning passed in a blur of motion, each task more mechanical than the last. I folded clothes, rearranged bookshelves, swept floors that didn't need sweeping. The hum of the vacuum filled the silence, but even that wasn't enough to drown out the unease pressing in on me. I avoided the back door entirely, as if ignoring it might keep him from returning. It was a futile hope. I knew he'd come back eventually. He always did. When the knock finally came, it startled me. Not because I hadn't expected it, but because of how quickly my body reacted. My chest tightening, my breath catching, my hands clenching into fists. I didn't answer right away, standing frozen in the middle of the room, the knock echoing again before I could will my feet to move. I opened the door to find him standing there, his posture casual, his face calm. He held a book in his hand, the same book he had borrowed weeks ago. He didn't say anything, just lifted it slightly as if to show why he had come. I stepped aside, letting him in without a word. It was easier that way. If I didn't speak, if I didn't acknowledge him, maybe I could keep everything from spiraling further. He moved through the house as if it belonged to him, taking his time, pausing to glance at things he'd seen 100 times before. I stayed in the living room, my back to him, my hands busy with a stack of mail that I suddenly needed to organize. The silence between us grew heavier, a tangible presence that filled every corner. When he finally appeared in the doorway, I braced myself. I didn't look up, didn't stop what I was doing. I felt him step closer, his movements deliberate, measured. The air seemed to shift, the room shrinking around us. He stood behind me for what felt like an eternity, his presence looming, until finally he spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, and the words barely registered over the pounding in my ears. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My body tensed, my hands still clutching the same envelope I had picked up minutes ago. He didn't move closer, didn't touch me, but his proximity was enough to make my heart race. When he stepped back, the shift in the air was almost physical. He walked toward the door, his footsteps unhurried. I turned just enough to see him leave, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that should have felt relieving. It didn't. The house was quiet again, but the silence was heavier than before. I sank into the couch, my hands trembling, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. I tried to shake it off, to remind myself that he was gone now, that the moment had passed. But it lingered, the tension still clinging to the air like a shadow that wouldn't fade. When my boyfriend came home that evening, his smile was the same as always, his warmth unchanged. He pulled me close, kissed the top of my head and talked about his day. I listened, nodded, even smiled back, but the weight in my chest didn't lift. We had dinner, watched a show, went through our usual routine. And yet, beneath the surface, I felt myself slipping further into the cracks. The fracture had widened and I no longer knew if it could be repaired. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, the tension in my chest became unbearable. I stared at the ceiling, the darkened room offering no solace. The thoughts that had haunted me for weeks now roared louder, each one a reminder of the line that had been crossed, the trust that had been broken. Sleep never came. I lay there, caught in the silence, waiting for the morning light and dreading the moment when I'd have to face another day. The morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and warm, promising a day as ordinary as any other. I woke early, the house still and quiet, the tension that had weighed me down feeling lighter, though I wasn't sure why. My boyfriend had already left for work, and the space he left behind felt peaceful. For the first time in what seemed like weeks, I felt like I could breathe. I decided to go for a walk, something I hadn't done in a long time. The air was crisp, the sun rising higher, and as I stepped outside, the weight in my chest began to lift. My feet carried me down familiar paths, past trees that swayed gently in the breeze. The routine, the normalcy, it grounded me, reminded me that the world was still turning. As I walked, my mind wandered back to everything that had happened. The tension, the confusion, the moments I couldn't explain. But now, with the distance and the clarity that the open air provided, I realized something I hadn't before. The control I had given up. I had let the silence, the unspoken glances, the weight of my own uncertainty dictate how I felt, how I acted. When I returned home, the house still felt quiet, but it no longer felt oppressive. I set about my usual chores with a new sense of purpose. It was as if the simple act of walking had shifted something inside me. The routine I had once used as a distraction now felt like a deliberate choice, a way to take back my day, my space, my mind. By evening, my boyfriend returned, his smile the same, his arms welcoming as he pulled me close. We sat down for dinner, talking about our day, and the warmth in his voice filled the room. The weight that had clung to me for so long began to fade, replaced by something new, a quiet, steady confidence. As we cleaned up, the house felt brighter. The laughter we shared, the normalcy of our routine. It was enough. I realized that the storm I'd been weathering wasn't one I had to face alone, but it wasn't one I had to let consume me either. When we finally settled into bed, the room dark and still, I lay there staring at the ceiling. My mind was calm for the first time in weeks. And as I closed my eyes, I smiled. A genuine, unexpected smile. I knew that the days ahead would still hold challenges, but for the first time I felt ready to face them. The cracks that had once threatened to pull me under were still there, but they no longer felt like the end of the story. They were just a part of it. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that I had found a way forward. Unexpected, surprising, and exactly what I needed.